So, good afternoon. Glad to be here today. And we're going to talk today about the legal rights of dyslexic students. This is a really important topic, and I am so pleased to have Andromeda Cartwright here to join me today. Andromeda is has many accolades to her background. She is a certified academic language therapist. She is a speech language pathologist. She has her master's in that. She is currently, oh, wait, I forgot one important one. She was the SPED director of Louisiana Key Academy Schools and still serves as oversight in that role. And she's also the chief academic officer for the Louisiana Key Academy school systems. So we're going to have a great talk today. And it's a really, like I said, it's an important talk because, a lot of times what we hear from parents is that the student's struggling, the parent goes and talks to the school, they're at the mercy of the school, they're not quite clear what to say, but they know that their child is struggling, and it doesn't appear a lot of times that the school is really helping or answering their questions or something in between there. So it's so important that you, as a parent or a dyslexic, understands what your rights are, understands, the full implication of what a dyslexic needs and by law should have access to. So I'm excited to be here, excited to have Andromeda, and so we welcome you to this podcast.
Good evening. I'm Andromeda Cartwright. I am currently the Chief Academic Officer for Louisiana Key Academy. My background is in speech language pathology. That's what I received my master's degree in. So I continue to have that certification. I'm also a certified academic language therapist as well. I've been working with Louisiana Key Academy for the last 8 to 9 years in a variety of roles in the special education sector as well as academics now. So I'm very excited to be here today and to speak with you all and share some information about the legal rights of dyslexic students.
So, what we want to talk about next is the right to an assessment. And it's important that you understand if your child is struggling, that you should start first by asking the teacher questions. And if your questions aren't answered, then go to the administration. Now, what happens typically in schools is if a child is struggling academically, and this is in the public schools, they are put in what is called response to intervention. And the response to intervention basically is a way of taking the child out of the general classroom, and they pull them 2 or 3 times a week for about 30 minutes with a group of other students. And on the surface, that might sound pretty good. The problem is your child's not going to be identified as dyslexic. They're just identified as struggling academically. They're going to be in a group with other students who probably, some of them might have dyslexia, but they may have other disabilities. And they're not, therefore, getting targeted instruction for a dyslexic student. So I've shown this before, but this special education law, and this is the second edition, and it's rights law, is a great book to have if you don't have, because what rights law tells us is if your child is struggling and the school says we want to put them in response to intervention, and then if the child doesn't do better, then we'll consider something else. You have the right to say, no, I want the child to be evaluated. And we're going to talk a little bit later about evaluation for an IEP. But you do not have to wait and let your child go through response to intervention, then do poorly before the child can get assessed for a disability. And Andromeda, you're nodding. So what else would you add to that?
I think it's also just really important for families to know how important that early assessment is as well. So making sure that you're having those conversations with the teachers, with the administrators at your school as early as possible when you first notice that there may possibly be an issue. Because we know that that reading gap for kids who are dyslexic, we can see that as early as in the first grade. So the earlier that your child is able to be identified, evaluated, and identified as being dyslexic, the better chance they have for receiving that evidence-based instruction early so that it can be most effective.
So waiting, what if the teacher or the school says, well, why don't we wait till third grade, or why don't we wait 6 months? You would say no.
I would absolutely say no. And that is unfortunately what a lot of parents hear. And we know that just in our work in evaluating students for dyslexia, we know that we hear a lot of stories from families where families talk about how they've known that something was wrong or they've had concerns sometimes before their children have even entered kindergarten. There are those really early signs of dyslexia that sometimes parents may notice and see that, hey, my child doesn't seem to be catching on to these things like their older sibling did, or like other kids that they are friends with or in the community do. So even though parents may not know everything about dyslexia, parents really have the greatest idea of being able to identify when something feels wrong with their specific child. So it's really important for parents to really understand their intuition, take that into account, and to make sure that they're asking those questions early, because we know that we can identify dyslexia as early as the spring of the kindergarten year. And the longer that we wait, even if that's 6 months, if that's to third grade, all of that is time that your child is missing in being able to be in that instruction that they need as a dyslexic child. So it's very important not to wait, even if that's the messaging that you're receiving from your child.
Yes, and I will say that if your school doesn't, you know, is not cooperating, you have a couple of options. If you're in Louisiana, and if you're in the Baton Rouge area, we do have the Dyslexia Resource Center, which does testing. If you're in an area that's not close to Baton Rouge, or if you're in another state, sometimes having a lawyer accompany you to the meetings, or even just mentioning the word, I'm gonna bring my, sometimes we'll get their attention and help make progress towards going the next step. So, and we did talk about in episode 3, if you haven't seen it, but that talks about the testing piece. So that's really important, as Andromeda said, early identification. And you just have to be like the persistent widow in the New Testament, and you just keep going. And if they don't want to do it, then you either look for testing somewhere else, like the Dyslexia Resource Center, or mention the word lawyer. So now we're going to talk about the importance of using the term dyslexia. And Andromeda's going to speak to that, why this is so important.
Sure. So just thinking about dyslexia, as Dr. Cassidy kind of talked a little bit about a bit earlier, we really want to make sure that we're using the term dyslexia. We don't want to lump a student who's dyslexic into a group such as a struggling reader or a child who has a learning disability, because we know that dyslexia is a very specific cause of reading difficulties in children. And we know that there is a path forward that is very specific and evidence based for the remediation of dyslexia. So it's very important just thinking about, even if we think about like the medical model, where we think about when you go to a doctor and you tell them that you have a sore throat, when you tell them that, they have to figure out what's the cause in order to figure out what is the correct treatment of something. So, for that same reason, we have to have that evaluation, identify your child as being dyslexic, because once they are identified, we then know what is that clear path forward to provide them with the intervention that they require.
Right. Now, what about, we've heard from people that two things. One, we've heard that they tell the child they have characteristics of dyslexia. What in the heck is that? And do
That is
you
a very good question.
advise that?
I definitely do not advise that. So that's that thing we just have to be super specific about calling dyslexia what it is. When we think about characteristics of dyslexia, there's not any clear guidelines that everybody's using to say if a student showcases characteristics of dyslexia. Most of the time, schools are looking at a checklist where they're checking off if a student meets a certain number of characteristics that a student may be dyslexic. But again, it doesn't give that child that true diagnosis of dyslexia, which gives the parent and the family that path forward to know what to do. So it's so important just to get that formal diagnosis. And we know that just thinking about characteristics of dyslexia, again, that's just grouping dyslexic students in with students who may have other disabilities that are causing them to have difficulty with reading. So only by pulling those students out, evaluating them, identifying them as dyslexic, that's the only way that we are able to then determine what instruction those kids need. And we know from just years of research what intervention dyslexic kids need. So they have to get that identification to be able to be on the path to that remediation.
And we're going to talk about the IEPs, but I think you could go ahead because this probably needs to be repeated a couple times. Because one of the issues, as you know, is that the IEPs often will say SLD, specific learning disability, and schools are sometimes think they cannot put the word dyslexia on the IEP. Is that correct?
So that is not correct. So schools are able to use the term dyslexia. So we really advocate and we also encourage families to advocate for that word, using the word dyslexia. We don't want to use the term specific learning disability, characteristics of dyslexia. We want to make sure that we're calling it what it is. So on the IEP, schools are able to have the term dyslexia. Dyslexia is currently under the category of SLD, but SLD is a very broad category. So it is very important that the IEP team uses the term dyslexia to be able to pull out specifically what your child's issue is, as opposed to just lumping it together with a variety of different disabilities that may have different treatments.
Yes, and if you really want to, sort of shock them, you can tell them that OSERS, OSERS, which is the Office of Special Ed up in Washington, D.C., they put out a notice when Obama was president, and it basically said, addressing this, you can and you should write dyslexia under SLD. So do not let the schools tell you anything different. It is within the law and it is advised because you want your child to have that specific diagnosis like Andromeda spoke about. So this is a good segue to talk about IEP plans. So I'm going to let you define it, Andromeda, and then discuss what it is and what rights come with it.
Sure. So the IEP is an individualized education plan. So when thinking about the IEP, that is a legal document that guarantees your child certain instruction, specialized instruction, as well as accommodations under the law. So once that evaluation is completed, your child can be identified as a child who has a certain exceptionality, as we're talking about that SLD, dyslexia specifically. So once a child is identified as needing that IEP, requiring that specialized instruction to address their academic needs that they have from their dyslexia, you would come together as a member of the IEP team, which would include your child's teachers. It may include some administrators from the school. You, as the parent, you're a very important part of that IEP team, and your opinion should always be taken into account as far as what accommodations you also feel that your child may need in the classroom to be able to access general education instruction. So that is very important that IEP guarantees those accommodations in the classroom, but also the different special education services or other services that your child may need.
Yeah, so I think it's important and that people understand the difference of the 504 plan and the IEP. And so the 504 plan is not a legal document like the IEP plan is. The 504 plan is just a plan to give you your child the accommodations, and we can talk about those accommodations, but I think uh, it's important, Andromeda, for people to understand the difference. So if you could give maybe, we've said at 504 is accommodations, because some parents will get that, but that's not going to teach your child how to read.
Exactly. So that is a very important distinction. And a lot of times schools are more willing to give kids 504 plans for their dyslexia as opposed to an IEP. Because again, with the 504, it's just giving accommodations. It doesn't guarantee any specific instruction that your child would need due to their dyslexia. So a lot of times it is easier for schools to just say, I'll give this student additional time. I'll read a test aloud to them. But like Dr. Cassidy talked about, that doesn't get to the root problem. That doesn't address your child's need to learn to read. So with the IEP, it actually guarantees them that instruction that they require to meet their IEP goals. And those IEP goals are really determined by the whole team. So as a parent, you also have the right to share in that team meeting what you feel your child's weaknesses are, their strengths, and what you would like to see addressed. So that IEP is really a much stronger document than a 504, although schools are usually more willing to think about the 504 just because that's an easier fix, quote unquote. But it is very important for families to have that knowledge of the difference between those two plans and for families to really feel comfortable advocating for their child through that evaluation and also for the IEP as well.
Yeah, so if your child is like first through fifth grade, they need that instruction that we've talked about, that Orton Gillingham based instruction, plus the oral reading, the out loud reading with the trained teacher. So if the school doesn't have that, there are cases, granted, it hasn't happened a lot, but I actually know one mother, and I know, that this is part of it. If you have a school that's near your school that has these resources, even if it's a private school, if that's what your child needs and it's on the IEP and the school can't get it, they really have to pay for you to go to the school that can give your child these needs. I can't emphasize how much more the legal document of an IEP gives a parent than the accommodations piece. And I think especially for that first through fifth grade, it's incredibly important. Now, Andromeda, what about, we talked about the 504. We haven't really said what the accommodations are, but would that be part of the IEP as well?
It definitely would. So with that 504, you're only getting accommodations, but the IEP covers that instruction, that specialized instruction that your child would need in addition to the accommodations. So all of those things from the 504 are accounted for in the IEP, but the IEP has those extra pieces of the goals for your child's different areas that they may have needs in, and that time as far as the minutes and things that they would receive of specialized instruction for their dyslexia.
And so for first through fifth graders, talk a little bit about what that time looks like. How many minutes are we thinking?
So for first through fifth grade, we focus on 90 minutes, 5 days a week. So as you think about like that response to intervention or different things like that, you can, and that is traditionally 2 or 3 times a week for 30 minutes. And that's in a group with kids who may not be dyslexic, with a teacher who doesn't necessarily have any specific training with dyslexia. So, in thinking about the IEP, the goal is to really have that specialized instruction occur in a small group for grades 1 through 5 with a trained teacher who knows what dyslexia is and how to work with students with dyslexia. And it would occur for 90 minutes, 5 days a week. So, every day of the school week.
Right. And that's from the National Reading Panel, and that's really the gold standard. That's what you want for your child in those early years. So we've been going back and forth. We've said the 504 plan is accommodations only. We've said the IEP is a specialized instruction with the accommodations. I think we should talk a little bit about what the accommodations are for a dyslexic child.
Sure. So I think that when we think about accommodations for dyslexic students, I think the biggest one that we always advocate for all kids with dyslexia, even as they grow older, is the extended time. So if we think about dyslexia, we know that students with dyslexia are using an inefficient system to read. So although through specialized instruction, through making sure that they're evaluated early, identified, and receiving instruction, dyslexic students can become better readers. They can become more fluent readers. But we do know because they have dyslexia that they will not be as fluent a reader as someone who isn't dyslexic. So that extended time is always going to be something that is very important first through fifth grade, even as your child gets into middle, high school, and beyond. Just because dyslexic kids can learn how to read, but they are going to always be slower readers and less fluent than someone who isn't dyslexic.
Yeah, and so it's really important if your child couple things I've seen. One, I've seen that teachers or schools will take away accommodations. They'll say, "Well, your child has a B in the class. They don't need accommodations anymore." Well, that's against the law. Basically, once you have a disability like dyslexia, you are given these accommodations, and the child is entitled to those. And it's not like, oh, Tuesday, Thursday we're doing accommodations, Monday, Wednesday, Friday we're not. That is not how it works. It is every day, and it is no matter what the grade is. So the extended time is very important, like Andromeda talked about, but there's also text to speech if that's necessary. There's a quiet room. Those would be some of the more common ones, but it is either the extra use of time or technology to help the child. It's not giving them a leg up, it is equalizing the playing field. The other thing that's important, like she was saying, is in older students, say the child's going to take the ACT, it is really important for those standardized tests that dyslexics get the extra time. What things that have caused problems that I've seen. They may say, "Oh, you were diagnosed, 4 years ago or 6 years ago. How do we know you have dyslexia?" Well, dyslexia is for life. You should not have to be retested again. They should use the testing that proved you were dyslexic, and that should be enough for the ACT or the SAT or any other standardized test. And a lot of people can't afford to do it again anyway. So that is important, and that could be a big difference when trying to enter a college, getting those grades. So make sure that you're talking early and with confidence to whoever is administering the ACT, because they're going to have to, then let the ACT know about the accommodations. So again, IEP 504, it's good to know these things specifically. Get that Rights Law special education book. Be confident, know the difference between accommodations versus the IEP. Make sure the word dyslexia is used. Now let's talk about the environment. What else is important? How that's delivered? What's the big picture? So Andromeda, tell us your experience and what are your thoughts?
Sure. So, with kids with dyslexia, it is so very important to also make sure that they are in a supportive environment where they understand what dyslexia is and they're taught what it is. Because a lot of kids come into that testing for dyslexia later in their school years. And a lot of times they come with a lot of having experienced a lot of academic failure, so you can imagine that that does a number on these kids' self esteem and self confidence. So it is so very important, just as it's important that they receive accommodations and that specialized instruction that they need. It's also very important that they are in a supportive environment where the teachers and everybody who works with them, their families, and everyone else really have that understanding of what dyslexia is. That these are very smart, intelligent kids who have that unexpected difficulty in reading. So it's very important to give them a space where they can really show off the things that they do really well, because we know that dyslexic kids struggle with reading, but they have a lot of other skills that they do amazing at. If we think about their ability to think critically, their ability to solve problems, think out of the box, and come up with creative solutions. So it's so very important to not just focus only on the deficits or the areas where dyslexic kids struggle with, but also to give them the space to celebrate the things that they really do amazing with. So I think that's so very important when thinking about that environment and just making sure that they are supported in a way that builds their self esteem and their self confidence.
So that would be the Shawitz's See a Strengths model, which is huge, and I know that the LKA schools really um, look to that and use that model. Can you talk a little bit about if we're talking about a supportive environment? What about uh, like project-based learning or STEM? What, or do they need like what's the best way to test the child? Like how do you really, if they're struggling with spelling, with most of them are, do you take points off for the spelling? Talk a little bit about those things.
Sure. So when thinking about those pieces, those are also things that are super important to just thinking about that supportive environment for dyslexic kids. So even when we've talked previously about accommodations, other things such as not taking points off due to spelling, the focus for dyslexic kids really should be on their content of their writing. Are they able to express themselves appropriately through writing? We know that with technology tools, which can also be used as accommodations on the IEP or the 504, that kids can use spell check. We have all these different tools that we have in place that really take that barrier away from dyslexic kids when we're thinking about spelling and other mechanics of writing. So it's very important to really focus on the content of their writing. Are they able to express themselves appropriately through writing? When thinking about testing them and things like that, we know that multiple choice questions aren't very good for dyslexic kids. We know that they do much better when they're provided with context to be able to answer a question or solve a problem. So, being really creative in the way that you assess them is so important. They may struggle with a multiple choice question, but they do very well when thinking about project based learning, being able to express themselves through maybe an oral presentation, through a project, um, through acting something out, just all these different ways to really show that they have the knowledge, but just giving them the way that they need to be able to express the knowledge that they have is so important. And when thinking about STEAM, that is another place where dyslexic students really shine. Just being able to be hands on, if you think about robotics and just different activities within the STEAM spectrum, that they really shine in those things and they really enjoy them. So that's another way to really thinking about that supportive environment. We don't want to just focus on these are the things that you struggle with. We really want to, on the flip side, spend a lot of time really celebrating the things that they do so well because they're really amazing. They're very smart and talented, and they have a lot to offer. So it is equally important to focus on both sides.
I think one of the things is um, they're smart. You want to make sure that you're giving them avenues so that they can show their strengths, like you said, and you have to have teachers, right, that understand that, because they can really struggle across the whole spectrum of academics, right? It could be um, the spelling we've talked about, the reading, it can be writing, and it can be math, right? Because it's so language heavy. So it's important that the teachers have that knowledge and are giving that feedback and no aura of, I don't think this child is really trying, but you know, I understand your disability, but I also know your strengths, and we're going to work to really bring those out.
Exactly.
I was telling somebody today, if the school years are just so hard for a dyslexic, if there can be, not for all, but those with severe dyslexia. But if you look at those that have graduated from college, if you look at Microsoft, Google, any of the tech companies, they're full of dyslexic kids, adults, and they even have these symposiums, and they have flyers that are say, we want to support the dyslexic in our workforce, and this is how you do it. So the job of K through 12 and then college is actually to keep that self-esteem intact, because they have so much to offer the world. If we can just get them through the language heavy education, then they're really going to contribute to the workforce, especially with this technology driven world. And I think what you're stressing, Andromeda, is that the parent's an advocate, but also you want the student to be an advocate as well, right?
Of course. I think that that's very important and that can start early. I think that for a lot of families, they ask questions about how to talk to their child about dyslexia, how to share that information with their child. And I think that even younger children, like as you think about like even your first and second graders, they can have some understanding of what's going on because I think that for students, no matter what age they are, they understand or they acknowledge and can see that they're having a difficulty. And I think it's so important and it's so empowering for them to be able to know the reason why and the reason behind it. So it is very important once your child is identified as being dyslexic to start having those conversations with them about what that means and really focusing on those that sea of strengths model and just talking to them about how smart they are, but this is something that you struggle with and this is why and this is what we're going to do about it. I think that that really empowers students. And also, as they get older, talking to them about the accommodations that they need, making sure that they're a part of that IEP team and able to come in and have discussions with you, with their teachers, with administration on campus to really advocate and say, these are the things that I need as a child with dyslexia.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's empowering for the student to know they're not guessing or thinking bad thoughts about why they're struggling. And then if they are confident, they can ask for what they need in a way that's, not offensive, but is a strong and demand. And again, they're the legal rights, and then they're just the way to ask for them. And I think having the parent and the student in sync, comfortable with that, is going to give the child the best outcomes. So, okay, so thank you so much for joining us, Andromeda. I mean, you're just a font of knowledge, and I think this has been a great discussion. Again, don't forget about the book, The Rights Law. Also, Andromeda works for the Louisiana Key Academy, and they have a website as well as the Dyslexia Resource Center, and you'll see the links to those below. So these are places that you can reach out, ask questions. Both organizations are here to support you so that you can get what you need from the school. And we want your child to succeed and reach their full potential, and it's certainly possible. So we thank you for listening, and we hope this helps you and your child. And we welcome you to come back for our next podcast.